close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Picture with me a moment suspended in time, a Japanese dawn in the year 1180, somewhere in a landscape of mist and shadow. Temple bells are ringing, their bronze voices carried on cold mountain air, ringing as they have rung for centuries, as they will ring for centuries more. The sound is slow, deliberate, each note floating into the darkness like a prayer made audible. Listen to that sound. Let it settle into your mind like water finding its level. The world is still. The world is waiting. In the valleys below, warriors are adjusting their armour, tightening the silk cords that bind breastplate to back. The metal plates, lacquered in deep blacks and reds, catch what little light exists in this pre-dawn hour. These men have been awake since before the first stars faded. Some of them will not see another sunset. They do not yet know this. Or perhaps they do, and it does not matter. The waiting is always the hardest part, that moment before movement, before the inevitable collision of steel and will and mortal flesh. The samurai breathe slowly, methodically, centering themselves. Some whisper prayers to the Buddha or to the Shinto kami, the spirits that inhabit the natural world. Others are silent, their minds already turned inward, already beginning the process of acceptance that will define their final hours. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand these warriors, to understand the choice they made, the choice that would echo through 7 centuries of history, we must go back further still, back to a time when warriors did not yet exist, back to a time when Japan was ruled by poets and court musicians instead of men clad in iron. Picture yourself now in the capital city of Kyoto, in the year 900. The year is not yet 1100. The imperial court reigns supreme, and the court is a place of almost impossible refinement. Silk robes in shades of plum and indigo and pale green, each layer precisely arranged so that the colours show in a specific order, a specific aesthetic. The Heian period has been unfolding for over a century now, and it is an age of extraordinary artistic flowering. Poetry is the highest form of expression. A man's worth is measured not by his skill with weapons, but by his ability to compose a perfect waka, a 31-syllable poem that captures the fleeting beauty of a season, a moment of human connection, the melancholy of impermanence. The imperial court celebrates cherry blossom season, with elaborate parties where nobles recite poetry to one another, while musicians play the biwa and the koto, stringed instruments whose notes seem to contain the essence of sadness itself. The air of the palace is thick with incense, sandalwood and agarwood, a fragrance so luxurious, so carefully chosen, that it speaks of a civilization concerned primarily with beauty and the cultivation of refined taste. The emperor sits at the centre of this world like a living deity, and his authority is absolute. At least that is what everyone believes. At least that is what the laws say. Yet even in this refined, beautiful world, even among the silk and the poetry and the sandalwood incense, something is shifting. Something is beginning to crack beneath the surface of courtly perfection. The provinces are growing restless. Far from Kyoto, far from the palace and the poetry and the carefully arranged robes, the land is wild and governed by distance. Local magistrates struggle to maintain order over vast territories. Bandits roam the highways. Small wars break out between competing clans over land rights and water rights and the simple, primal struggle for survival and dominance. Villages burn. Crops are destroyed. The common people suffer while the imperial court remains isolated in its protected world of beauty and artistic refinement. The imperial court is beautiful, but increasingly powerless to control the world beyond its gates. In desperation, the court begins to hire warriors, trained fighters who will serve as private armies for wealthy nobles. At first, these warriors are considered almost shameful, a necessity born of weakness rather than a mark of status. They are called bushi. The word simply means warriors, and it carries with it a trace of contempt from the refined aristocrats of the court. Yet something is happening in the provinces that will eventually change everything. These bushi, these hired warriors, are becoming organized. They are forming clans, dynasties, networks of loyalty that begin to resemble something like kingdoms within the kingdom. They are developing their own codes of conduct, their own values, their own understanding of what it means to be a man of honor. Among these clans, 2 will eventually rise above all others, will grow so powerful that their conflict will shake the entire island of Japan and give birth to an entirely new order of society. The first of these clans is the Taira, also known as the Heike, and they rise to prominence in the west and central regions of Japan. Their strongholds are built in strategic locations, controlling commerce and military movement. Their wealth grows from land taxes and the control of important shipping routes. The second clan is the Minamoto, also known as the Genji, and they establish their power base in the mountainous eastern provinces, in the lands of wild forests and deep valleys, where different values and different ways of thinking have taken root. For generations, these two families coexist in an uneasy balance of power. They serve the emperor, at least nominally. They obey the court, at least on the surface. The great lords and their retainers make ceremonial appearances in Kyoto. They present gifts to the imperial family. They participate in court rituals. But the reality is that power is flowing away from Kyoto, away from the poets and the incense, and toward these warrior families. The economic power of the provinces is growing. The military might of the warrior clans is becoming undeniable. And then, in the year 1156, there is a crisis that will strip away the pretense and force an open confrontation. The emperor dies. A succession dispute arises, a question of which imperial child should inherit the throne. The court splits into factions. Different noble families support different candidates. The question becomes not a matter of succession law, but a matter of raw power. Who has the military strength to impose their will? The Taira and Minamoto clans are called upon to settle the matter by force. What happens next is the Hogan Rebellion, a brief but violent conflict that marks a turning point in Japanese history. For the first time, the power of the warrior clans is openly displayed. For the first time, the court realizes the full extent to which its own authority has been eclipsed. The streets of Kyoto itself become a battleground. The imperial palace compound is attacked. Warriors fight with swords and spears in the gardens, where poets had once recited verses. By the end of the rebellion, the Taira clan has emerged victorious, and their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, becomes the most powerful man in Japan. The emperor remains the emperor, still draped in silks, still issuing decrees from his palace in Kyoto, but everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest courtier, knows the truth now. Power no longer belongs to the court. Power belongs to the warrior. For 30 years, the Taira maintain their dominance. Kiyomori is a remarkable man, not merely a warrior, but a sophisticated politician who understands how to balance the old court world with the new warrior world. He's descended from the imperial family himself, which gives him a kind of legitimacy that other warrior lords lack. He plants his family deeper into the aristocracy through careful marriages and alliances. He arranges marriages between his daughters and the imperial family, creating bonds of kinship that intertwine the Taira clan with the imperial succession itself. He ensures that his clan controls not just military power, but the organs of government itself. His relatives become court officials. His family gains wealth and land. The Taira reach a level of power that no warrior clan had reached before, and yet even as the Taira rise higher and higher, as their wealth grows and their influence spreads across the islands of Japan, like roots extending through earth, seeds of discord are being sown in the east. The Minamoto clan, defeated but not destroyed, waits in the distant provinces. They cultivate alliances with other warrior families who have grown resentful of Taira dominance. They train their sons in the martial arts. They remember their earlier glory and nurse their grievances. The memory of defeat becomes a kind of sacred wound, a source of motivation that drives every action, every strategy, every long-term plan. And among the Minamoto, one man is born who will become the most consequential warrior in Japanese history, Minamoto no Yoritomo. For a long time, Yoritomo is no one of importance. He is a child when his family is defeated by the Taira in an earlier conflict. He watches his father die. He is spared execution only because he is too young to pose an immediate threat, and because Kiyomori, for all his ruthlessness, has some respect for the old traditions. But Yoritomo is forced into exile in the eastern provinces, far from the capital, far from power, far from any position of authority or influence. He is sent to live in the mountains, in the wild territories where the Minamoto once held sway. For years he is little more than a prisoner, closely watched, restricted in his movements, and yet exile is also an education. It is in the east, in the wild countryside far from the refined world of Kyoto, that Yoritomo comes to understand something that the Taira have never fully grasped, that true power comes not from the emperor's approval, but from the allegiance of men, from the bonds of loyalty between warrior and leader, from the ability to inspire thousands of fighting men to follow you unto death if necessary. Yoritomo spends his years of exile learning the temperament of the Eastern warrior clans. He understands that these men have different values than the court-oriented Taira. They respect military skill above all else. They respect a man who can lead them, who can protect them, who can unite them against common enemies. They are not impressed by court ceremonies or imperial appointments. They respond to strength, to clarity of purpose, to a leader who shows them the path to glory and honour. In 1180, Yoritomo's moment comes. The Taira have grown arrogant. They have moved the imperial court itself to distant cities in the west, attempting to rule the realm from strength rather than from the traditional capital in Kyoto. This decision alienates many people who revere tradition. The Taira have also made enemies of the Buddhist temples, which are powerful political and military forces. The major temples have their own armies of warrior monks. They resent Taira interference in religious affairs. They resent Taira taxation and control. Additionally, the Taira have begun to lose the support of some of their own clan members. Internal divisions are forming. Not all Taira leaders agree with Kiyomori's increasingly harsh methods of maintaining power. Some believe the clan has overextended itself. And then Yoritomo, waiting in exile, waiting for the moment he has perhaps known would come, calls his clans to war. The call goes out in the east, passed from man to man, spreading through villages and mountain passes like a wind carrying seeds of possibility. The Minamoto are rising again. The old order is being challenged. The eastern warriors, who have chafed under Taira dominance, rally to Yoritomo's banner. He is not yet a legendary figure, but he is a Minamoto, the son of a great general, and he carries with him the weight of history and the hopes of those who resent Taira power. What follows is not a brief conflict, but a vast, sprawling war that will consume Japan for 5 years. It is called the Genpei War, Genpei being another name for the Minamoto and Taira clans combined, a way of speaking about the conflict as a whole, as the struggle between these two titanic forces. And it is in the stories of the Genpei War that the true samurai ideal is born. The battles are enormous, nothing like the brief skirmishes of earlier times. Armies numbering in the thousands clash on plains and in narrow valleys. There are cavalry charges through fields where dust rises in massive clouds, where the thunder of hooves sounds like the gods themselves are marching across the earth. There are desperate last stands in mountain passes, where a small force of defenders holds off a much larger attacking force, not hoping to win but hoping to inflict enough casualties to slow the enemy's advance. There are moments of individual heroism that will be remembered and retold for centuries. Warriors ride into battle on horses, arrows whistling past them like deadly birds, singing death poems to themselves as they go, knowing they will not return. The code of honor is beginning to crystallize even in the midst of this chaos and bloodshed, refined by the reality of constant warfare. A true warrior does not surrender. A true warrior does not beg for mercy. A true warrior accepts death with composure if that is what honor demands. A true warrior fights not for personal glory alone, but for his lord, for his clan, for his honor and the honor of his ancestors. Listen to the sound of what these battles must have been like. The thunder of hooves on packed earth, the twang of bowstrings releasing 100 arrows at once, arrows rising into the air in a great arc, thousands of projectiles cutting through the sky. Listen to the metallic whistle of arrows as they descend. The sound of arrows striking armor with sharp metallic cries that echo across the battlefield. Listen to the sound of sword against sword, steel singing as two weapons meet, the particular note that two well-made swords make when they collide. Listen to the shouts of commanders, the prayers whispered by men about to die, the screams of men and horses, the sound of flesh being cut, the heavy silence that sometimes falls between moments of intense action. Listen, and let these sounds fade into the background of your mind now, like a distant echo that grows fainter the further you travel from the battle. All around us in this sleep story there are sounds that belong to ancient Japan, and we will hear them again before this night is through. But let us focus now on the greatest moment of this great war, the moment that will define everything that comes after, the moment that will become the most famous battle in Japanese history. In 1185, in the final year of the Genpei War, the last great battle of the conflict takes place in the Strait of Shimonoseki, a narrow passage of water between the main island of Honshu and the smaller island of Kyushu. It is a naval battle, a rarity in Japanese warfare, a type of combat that requires different skills than land fighting. The samurai are primarily cavalry warriors, trained to fight on horseback with bow and sword. Naval warfare is unfamiliar to them, the Taira fleet carrying not just warriors, but also the imperial court itself, the emperor, the imperial family, the government officials, the treasures of state, attempts to flee south toward Kyushu, away from the pursuing Minamoto forces. The Minamoto fleet pursues relentlessly. The battle that ensues is chaotic and terrible, a scene of incredible violence and also of strange beauty. Men die by drowning as well as by the sword. Bodies float on the water. The surface of the strait is coloured red with blood mixing with seawater. The Taira, knowing their defeat is inevitable, knowing they cannot escape, make the choice that will define them for all of history and cement their place in the memory of the Japanese people forever. Rather than surrender to the Minamoto and face capture and execution, they choose death. Not merely death, but a kind of death that carries its own meaning, its own honour. Mothers leap from ships into the sea, holding their children in their arms, choosing to take their own lives and those of their children, rather than face what they perceive as degradation and enslavement. Warriors who have lost their will to fight, warriors who are surrounded, warriors who understand their situation is hopeless, simply walk into the waves. Their armour, which has been their protection throughout their lives, weighs them down, dragging them under the water. They accept this. This is the choice of the warrior. And the child emperor Antoku, a boy of only 8 years old, is taken by his grandmother into the water. She sings a lullaby to him, a traditional poem of comfort, as she holds him and steps into the depths. Her voice is steady. Her hand is firm. She holds him close as the water rises above them both. No one knows exactly what she sang, though historians have speculated. Some believe it was an old Buddhist chant, a prayer to guide the soul to the Pure Land, the Buddhist heaven. Others believe it was a traditional Japanese poem, perhaps words that speak of the beauty of nature, of the impermanence of all things. Whatever the words, they were meant to ease his transition into the afterlife, to give him peace as he left this world, to tell him that what she was doing was an act of love, not an act of cruelty. The child emperor drowns in the arms of his grandmother. The entire imperial court does not survive Dan-no-Ura, but a great many of the Taira clan dies in this battle, or chooses to follow their lord into death in the days and weeks that follow. It is, in the eyes of the samurai who survive it, the moment when a new standard is set, the moment when it becomes clear that death in defense of honor is not a tragedy, but the highest form of nobility. When the battle ends, when the water grows calm again, and the last screams fade into silence, when the sun rises on a new day over the strait, the Minamoto have won total victory. Yoritomo, the man who called the clans to war, now holds supreme power over the islands of Japan. The emperor is restored to Kyoto, a different emperor, a living successor to the child who drowned. But everyone understands that the emperor is now merely a figurehead, a symbol of continuity and legitimacy, but not a wielder of real power. Real power has shifted entirely to the warrior class. In 1185, Yoritomo establishes a new form of government in the city of Kamakura, a city in the east, far from the imperial capital of Kyoto, far from the world of court ceremonies and courtly intrigue. This government is called the shogunate, and the leader is called the shogun. The word shogun means generalissimo, or commander-in-chief, and the title itself explains the nature of the arrangement perfectly. The shogun is the military ruler, the man who holds real authority over the islands, while the emperor remains the symbolic head of state, draped in his silks in distant Kyoto, performing the ceremonial and religious functions that have been associated with the imperial office since the beginning of Japanese civilization. The emperor is a kind of sacred figurehead, revered, but powerless. The shogun is the true ruler, the man who makes decisions about war and peace, about taxation, about the distribution of power and land throughout the realm. This division of power will persist in one form or another for nearly 700 years. From 1185 until 1868, Japan will be ruled by shoguns, first Yoritomo and his descendants for several generations, and then other samurai families when the Minamoto line eventually weakens and is replaced by other warrior dynasties. And this period, this vast sweep of centuries during which military rulers govern while emperors reign but do not rule, will see the development and refinement of a code, a philosophy, a way of being that will define the samurai and will eventually export itself into the imagination of the entire world. We call this code Bushido, the way of the warrior. The kanji characters that compose this word carry meaning. Bu meaning warrior or military, shi meaning warrior or gentleman, and du meaning way or path. Bushido is the way of the warrior, the path that a samurai walks, the code that governs his behavior and his understanding of honor and obligation. But what is Bushido truly? What beliefs lie at the heart of it? The samurai who lived through the Genpei War could not have articulated it fully in that moment. The code evolved gradually, refined through centuries of warfare, shaped by Buddhist and Shinto religions, influenced by Chinese philosophy and Chinese warrior traditions, hardened by the daily practice of violence and honor, crystallized through the actions of great leaders and the stories told about them. Yet, from the beginning, certain principles are clear and unmistakable. A samurai owes absolute loyalty to his lord. This is not a negotiable principle, but the foundation upon which everything else rests. A samurai is willing to die for his lord, and indeed there is a practice that will later become formalized called seppuku, ritual suicide, the act of opening one's own belly with a sword in a controlled, deliberate manner, in which a samurai takes his own life rather than face capture or dishonor, rather than bring shame upon his family name or his lord's honor. A samurai is expected to master martial skills, but also to cultivate refined tastes, to appreciate poetry, to understand the arts, to be learned in classical texts and philosophical works. This is the paradox at the heart of the samurai. He is both brutal warrior and refined aesthete, a man comfortable wielding a sword and also comfortable composing a beautiful poem about cherry blossoms. A samurai is expected to face death with composure, to accept his mortality, and indeed there is a Zen Buddhist influence here. The idea that acceptance of death frees a man to live with authentic purpose, to be fully present in each moment because he is not clinging to life out of fear, because he has made his peace with the inevitability of his own ending. When we look at the samurai now across the centuries, when we study the stories that were preserved and the codes that were written down in later periods, we see men who lived according to these principles with remarkable consistency. They were, in many ways, obsessed with death. But this obsession was not morbid or suicidal in a mindless way. Rather, it was a philosophical stance, a way of thinking about existence that transformed fear into freedom. By accepting death, by making peace with mortality, a man freed himself from the paralyzing fear that makes people act dishonorably, that makes them betray their principles, that makes them cling to survival at any cost. A man who has already decided he is willing to die cannot be threatened or coerced. A man who is at peace with his own mortality can act with perfect clarity and perfect courage. This is the psychological genius of the samurai code. This is why samurai warriors were so often described by those who faced them as almost fearless, almost superhuman in their composure and their willingness to engage in combat. And this code, this philosophy, this way of being, did not simply arise from abstract thinking in monastic cells or scholarly halls. It was forged in battles like Dan no Yura, in the crucible of actual warfare and actual death, in the experiences of real men facing real mortality and discovering that acceptance was the pathway to authentic strength. For now, in the late 12th century, in the Kamakura period that has just begun, the samurai are establishing themselves as a ruling class. They are not merely warriors hired to fight occasional battles. They are becoming administrators, landholders, the new aristocracy of Japan. Yoritomo distributes land and titles to the samurai who supported him in the Genpei War, creating a system somewhat analogous to feudalism in medieval Europe. Though Japanese feudalism took different forms and operated on different principles, shaped by different cultures and different histories, these warrior landholders, called daimyo or great names, established themselves as regional lords throughout Japan. They in turn have samurai retainers who serve them directly, creating a complex hierarchy of obligations and loyalties. A complex hierarchy of loyalty develops, with each samurai serving a lord and being served by lesser warriors. The system is strengthened by ritual and ceremony. There are formal oaths of loyalty taken in front of religious officiants. There are elaborate codes of conduct that are transmitted from teacher to student, from master to apprentice. There are expectations of behavior that are transmitted through stories and legends about great samurai of the past, about their acts of courage and their choices in moments of crisis. The Kamakura period unfolds through the 13th and early 14th centuries, and it is a time of relative stability despite being a time of continued warfare. Rival clans still fight over territory and influence. There are internal conflicts within the shogunate itself, as different samurai families compete for power and position. The Minamoto line itself eventually weakens, and power passes to the Hojo clan, who rule as regents behind a succession of young shoguns. But for the first time in Japanese history, there is a central military authority strong enough to maintain some measure of order across the islands. There is a code of law that applies throughout the realm. There is a clear hierarchy of power. It is not perfect. There are still conflicts and violence. But there is a structure, an order, a sense that Japan is governed by consistent principles rather than by the whims of individual lords. It is into this world, in the year 1274, that something completely unexpected and terrifying arrives. The Mongol Empire. Kublai Khan, the great Mongol conqueror who has already assembled the largest land empire the world has ever known, an empire that stretches from Korea to Eastern Europe, from the Arctic to Southeast Asia, turns his gaze toward Japan. He has recently conquered Korea and China. He is accustomed to victory. He believes nothing can resist his military machine. He assembles a massive invasion fleet. Estimates suggest between 23 and 40,000 soldiers, and he sends it across the Korea Strait toward the islands of Japan. The fleet carries not just warriors but siege weapons, supplies, officers trained in the conquest of cities. No one in Japan has ever faced anything like the Mongol military machine. The Mongols are the most advanced warriors in the world at this time, equipped with the finest weapons and armor, trained in tactics of large-scale organized warfare. They use gunpowder weapons, cannons and hand cannons, technology that Japan has not yet developed. The very existence of these weapons shocks the Japanese. The invasion comes as a shock to the shogunate. It forces a fundamental re-examination of samurai strategy and tactics. The samurai, for all their skill and bravery, are not initially equipped to face this kind of invasion. They are cavalry warriors, trained in individual combat and small unit tactics, the kind of warfare that has dominated Japanese battlefields for generations. They are not prepared for the massed formations and coordinated attacks of the Mongol army. They are not familiar with defending against cannon fire. In the battles on the beaches and plains of northern Kyushu, the samurai are outmatched in some respects by the sheer technological superiority and organizational power of the Mongol forces. But they are not defeated. Not yet. They fight with desperation and skill. They adapt their tactics. They harass the Mongol forces, preventing them from gaining a secure beachhead. Instead of collapsing in the face of superior technology, the samurai demonstrate the flexibility and adaptability that will characterize their response to military challenges throughout their history. But then, something miraculous occurs, or something that the Japanese understand as miraculous, something that will shape Japanese consciousness for generations to come. As the Mongol fleet prepares for a second invasion, as Kublai Khan gathers his forces for a massive assault in 1281, a typhoon strikes the Korea Strait. The storm is enormous, violent, destructive beyond all measure. It appears at precisely the moment when the Mongol fleet is most vulnerable, when the invasion force is scattered and vulnerable. The storm smashes the Mongol fleet with terrible force. Thousands of Mongol soldiers are drowned. The ships sink. The invasion force is scattered, destroyed, unable to regroup and attack. The Japanese call this typhoon the kamikaze, the divine wind, and they understand it as a sign that Japan is protected by the gods, that the land itself is sacred and defended by forces beyond the mortal realm. The interpretation is not merely religious, but deeply, fundamentally political and spiritual. The gods themselves are protecting Japan. Japan is chosen. Japan is sacred. The significance of this cannot be overstated. In the minds of the samurai, in the consciousness of Japan as a whole, the Mongol invasions, followed by the miraculous typhoon, confirm something that Buddhist and Shinto religions had already suggested. Japan is chosen by the gods. The samurai themselves are the instruments of divine protection. Their duty to their lords is not merely a practical matter of military service, but a sacred obligation, a calling that connects them to the spiritual forces that protect the nation. This understanding deepens the code of honor. This crystallizes the samurai ideal even further. A samurai is not merely a professional soldier. He is a sacred servant of forces larger than himself. His willingness to die in service to his lord is participation in something cosmic and eternal. The samurai who dies in battle does not simply cease to exist. He becomes part of something sacred, something that will be remembered and revered by generations to come. His name will be inscribed in temple records. His deeds will be recounted in stories and poetry. His spirit will be honored in ceremonies. Death in service is not an ending but a transformation into something eternal. In the centuries that follow the Mongol invasions, as the Kamakura shogunate gradually gives way to other ruling families, as regional daimyo become increasingly powerful, and the islands of Japan fragment into competing domains, the samurai code continues to evolve and harden. The practice of seppuku becomes more formally ritualized, more clearly defined, more clearly understood as an obligation in certain circumstances. The samurai becomes not only a warrior, but a complete system of values and aesthetics. To be a samurai means to live according to a specific moral code, to cultivate specific skills, to appreciate specific forms of beauty, to accept specific obligations. It means never questioning an order from your lord, or if you must question, then dying rather than disobeying. It means being willing to die rather than betray your oath of loyalty. It means understanding that shame is worse than death, that capture is unacceptable, that survival without honor is a kind of living death, more terrible than actual death. It means taking one's own life rather than allowing oneself to fall into captivity, rather than allowing oneself to be tortured for information, rather than living to see one's family name dishonored. And these principles, which begin to be formalized in the centuries after Dan-no-Ura and the Mongol invasions, will come to define the samurai for the remaining 6 centuries of their existence on the Japanese islands. If you are a listener of the Calm Archive, if you have found your way to us in the quiet hours of night, seeking a voice to guide you towards sleep, seeking stories that will pull you gently down into rest, then you know the power of words spoken slowly, the power of narrative to quiet the mind. We are grateful for your trust. This is the Calm Archive, and we tell stories designed to help you sleep, designed to give your conscious mind something beautiful to follow, while your deeper self releases its hold on the day's anxieties and concerns, while your body begins to sink into the rest it needs. If you have not yet subscribed, we invite you to do so now and join the growing community of night listeners who have made the Calm Archive part of their sleep routine. There is something sacred, we believe, in the ritual of listening, of being read to in the darkness, of allowing your mind to drift through historical landscapes and emotional depths, while your body finds the rest it needs. We are honored to be part of your night. Now, let us return deeper into our story. The centuries unfold. Japan becomes fragmented, divided into warring states, a period called the Sengoku, the age of civil war. Daimyo fight daimyo over territory and power. Some of the great samurai warlords like Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi rise to prominence, attempting to unify the scattered domains. Battles are fought with increasing sophistication. Firearms are introduced, dramatically changing the nature of warfare. Castles are built and besieged, towering structures of stone designed to withstand cannon fire. And throughout all of this, through 500 years of constant warfare, the samurai code persists and deepens. Warriors practice calligraphy and poetry alongside swordplay. They meditate in Zen temples, sitting in silence, facing their own minds, confronting the ego and the illusions that bind most people to suffering. They understand their lives as temporary, fleeting, beautiful, precisely because they are temporary. They look at cherry blossoms, those flowers that bloom for only a few days, displaying extraordinary beauty before falling to the ground, returning to earth, and they see their own lives reflected there, brief, intense, meaningful because of their brevity. This is the aesthetic sensibility that permeates the samurai world. This is the world of the samurai at its fullest expression. The samurai of this era are men shaped by their understanding of death. They have studied martial arts from childhood, learning swordplay from masters, learning how to move through space with efficiency and grace, learning how to kill. They understand the weight of a katana, the sword that has become the symbol of the samurai class, understand the precise movement required to draw it from its sheath and strike in a single fluid motion, a movement that requires years of training and practice to perfect. They understand how a sword feels when it cuts through flesh and bone. They understand blood. They understand pain. They understand the sounds of death, the expressions on a dying man's face, the weight of carrying another person's death in your memory. And because they understand these things, because they have made peace with the reality of violence and death, they are able to live with a kind of freedom that most people never experience. They are not crushed by fear. They are not paralyzed by anxiety about the future. They are present in each moment because they do not cling to life out of desperation. They do not beg. They do not bargain. They do not try to escape their fate. And this acceptance, this composure in the face of death, is what creates the legends that surround the samurai. It is what causes poets and storytellers to immortalize them. It is what causes people to listen to stories about them, as you are listening now in the quiet hours of night, allowing their stories and their values to seep into your consciousness, to shape your understanding of honor and courage and the meaning of a well-lived life. There is a particular silence that follows a death in the samurai tradition. When a warrior falls in battle, when a samurai chooses seppuku rather than face capture, when a man makes the ultimate sacrifice for his lord, there is a moment of absolute stillness. The world seems to pause. The other warriors present understand that they have witnessed something sacred, something that should be remembered, something that will be retold. The death of a samurai is not merely a cessation of biological life. It is a culmination of a particular way of living, a moment when all the values and principles that guided a man's life are crystallized into one final act. A samurai goes to his death the way a pilgrim arrives at a shrine he's been walking toward his entire life. There is completion in it. There is a strange kind of peace. The expression on his face is often described as serene, calm, almost as if he has finally reached the place he was always meant to be. The samurai of medieval and early modern Japan lived in a landscape of extraordinary beauty. We have spoken before about the aesthetic sensibility that runs through Japanese culture. The love of simplicity, of suggestion rather than explicit statement, of emptiness and space. A samurai would walk through a bamboo forest and understand not just the physical reality of the bamboo stalks rising around him, but the philosophical reality, the way bamboo bends in the wind but does not break, the way it embodies both strength and flexibility, the way it teaches a lesson about how to move through life. He would smell the earth after rain and understand something about impermanence and renewal, about the cycle of seasons and the way all things return to the soil from which they came. He would look at a stone garden, carefully raked, with a few carefully placed rocks and perhaps a single tree, and he would see everything he needed to know about the universe, the vastness suggested by emptiness, the importance of what is not shown as much as what is shown, the way that suggestion is more powerful than explicit statement. This aesthetic sensibility was not separate from the samurai's martial training and code of honor. Rather, it was intimately connected to it. A warrior who understood the philosophical depth of a stone garden, who could appreciate the suggestion and simplicity in a painting of mountains barely visible through mist, was a warrior who understood restraint, precision, the power of doing only what is necessary and no more. This training of the aesthetic sensibility was training for combat. The two were not separable. A man who could find beauty in emptiness could face emptiness with courage. And so we arrive at the threshold of a new era. The samurai have established themselves as the ruling class of Japan. Their code has been refined through centuries of warfare and artistic cultivation. They understand themselves as instruments of divine will, as sacred defenders of their nation and their lords. They are comfortable with death. They are skilled in combat. They are cultured and educated. They are the full expression of a particular civilization's ideals, a civilization that has somehow managed to unite the warrior and the artist, the man of action and the man of contemplation into a single ideal figure. But the story of the samurai is only beginning. The code that would define them, Bushido, the way of the warrior, had not yet been fully written down, had not yet been codified in the great text that would eventually become the philosophical foundation of the samurai class. The greatest works of samurai literature and philosophy were still to come. The most famous samurai stories, the tales that would eventually be known all around the world, had not yet been recorded. What was coming in the centuries ahead would transform these provincial soldiers and refined administrators into something the world had never seen before, a living legend, a code of conduct that would inspire people across cultures and centuries, a way of understanding honor and loyalty and the meaning of a well-lived life that would echo through history like the temple bells that ring in our opening moment, ringing and ringing, the sound never quite dying away, always present in the background of the Japanese consciousness. The samurai would reach the height of their power and then would face a fundamental choice. They could fight to preserve a dying order, clinging to the world as it had always been, or they could embrace a new world and find new meaning in it. And in that choice, in the final centuries of the samurai era, their final chapter would be written, a chapter as dramatic and moving as anything that came before. The calm archive, the samurai, warriors who chose death over dishonor for 700 years, sections 3+4, minutes 40 to 70. The world had changed, but the samurai remained. It was now the Muromachi period, and a new name hung over Japan, the Ashikaga shogunate. But what rose from their courts was something far more intricate and mysterious than the warrior cultures that had come before. Between 1336 and 1573, something profound happened to the soul of the samurai. The sword did not disappear, but it found company. Into the warrior's hands came the brush, the scroll, the teacup. Into his carefully constructed mind came the void, and in that void he discovered something truer than any battlefield could ever teach. This was the moment when the samurai transformation became complete, not through conquest, but through refinement, not through the expansion of power, but through the cultivation of emptiness. The greatest samurai of this era were not always the ones who won the most battles, but those who understood that the journey inward was more dangerous and more rewarding than any outward campaign. This was the era when samurai began to understand that a warrior's strength lay not only in his muscles and reflexes, but in his spirit's capacity to hold emptiness. The influence of Zen Buddhism, which had been seeping into samurai culture like water through temple stones, now saturated every aspect of their existence. In the meditation halls, in the gardens, in the rituals of daily life, this samurai found a philosophy that made sense of their role as men trained to kill, yet yearning for something beyond violence. Zen taught them that there was no separation between the warrior and the mystic, between the sword and the lotus, between death and the infinite present moment. This was not a comfortable teaching. Zen demanded that the samurai sit face to face with his own mortality, that he strip away every illusion about who he was and what his life meant. But in that stripping away, something extraordinary happened. Fear began to dissolve. The grasp of ego loosened. The samurai who sat in meditation for 10 years, watching his thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds passing over a mountain, became more fearless than the warrior who had won 100 battles. Imagine, if you will, a samurai in the early evening, moving through a temple garden that has taken decades to perfect. The light is failing, painting everything in gradations of lavender and grey. Each pebble in the gravel path has been placed with intention. Each twisted pine branch has been coaxed into its exact position through years of careful pruning. The sound of water trickling from a stone basin reaches his ears, the sound of impermanence itself, of continuous flow, of nothing ever being still. As he walks, his hand runs along a stone lantern, its surface weathered by centuries. And in this moment, moving through space that is simultaneously a garden and a meditation, he begins to understand the teachings of the Zen masters. The garden is not a place, it is a state of mind made visible. It is nature reduced to its essence, showing him that in simplicity lies truth, and in emptiness lies the fullest abundance. The Muromachi samurai became artists because killing alone was no longer enough. The warrior tradition had evolved beyond the crude brutality of earlier centuries. Now, a samurai was expected to cultivate what the Japanese called the way, not just the way of the sword, but a comprehensive philosophy of living. This way extended into the tea ceremony, or chado, a practice that seems impossibly simple until you understand its depths. To prepare tea, to serve tea, to drink tea with another person, these actions become a meditation on impermanence, hospitality, and the beauty found in utilitarian objects. The teacup in your hand is not merely ceramic. It is a vessel that has absorbed centuries of human intention. Its glaze might be imperfect, asymmetrical, and for this reason, it is profound. The samurai who practiced chado learned to appreciate wabi-sabi, the aesthetic philosophy that finds profound beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. In the tea room, a small, humble space with a single window and floor of dark wood, a samurai might spend 2 hours preparing a bowl of powdered green tea for a guest. Every movement is prescribed. Every movement means something. The way he enters, the way he kneels, the way his hand moves as he whisks the powder into hot water, creating a froth of jade green. There is no hurrying. There is no distraction. In a world of constant warfare and uncertainty, the tea ceremony created an island of absolute control, of perfect presence, of time stepping outside of time. Some samurai found this to be as demanding as any sword training, and in a different way, just as deadly. For to master the tea ceremony was to master the mind. To master the mind was to master fear. Alongside Chado came Ikebana, the art of flower arranging, which transformed the simple act of placing flowers into a philosophical inquiry. Unlike the European approach of creating an abundance of blooms in a vase, Ikebana worked with emptiness and suggestion. 3 flowers might be arranged to suggest an entire landscape. The space around the flowers was as important as the flowers themselves. A single branch, stripped of all but 3 leaves, might hang in absolute stillness, teaching the viewer that silence speaks, that what is absent can be more powerful than what is present. The samurai who arranged flowers learned to see the world through the lens of reduction, of choosing exactly which elements mattered and discarding everything else. In a sword fight, this skill became invaluable. Which movements matter, which movements waste energy, which moments in the dance of combat are the ones where victory is decided. The No theatre emerged as another expression of samurai aesthetics. These were plays of extraordinary restraint and power, performed with minimal movement, often by actors in masks that seemed to hold entire universes of emotion. A No actor might move 3 steps across the stage, and in those 3 steps, convey the passage of years, the transformation of a human into a ghost, the inexorable movement toward death. The samurai who watched these performances, or who learned to perform in them, absorbed lessons in the power of what is not shown, in the overwhelming impact of subtle gesture. The philosophy was this: the smallest movement, executed with perfect presence, contains more truth than 1,000 frantic motions. In combat, this understanding revolutionized swordsmanship. The greatest duelists were not those who moved the fastest, but those who moved with the most clarity, whose every motion was necessary and purposeful. Ink painting, or sumi-iya, became a meditation on the nature of existence itself. The artist would sit before a blank white paper with a single brush and ink, and through discipline and years of study, would learn to suggest entire mountains with just a few brush strokes. A misty valley could be painted by leaving much of the paper blank. A forest could be evoked through the careful placement of 7 or 8 marks. The philosophy behind this art was that the artist's job was not to copy reality, but to capture the spirit of what they saw, the essential truth beneath the surface appearance. A samurai studying painting learned to see the world in a new way, to understand that the most powerful communication comes not from what you include, but from what you omit. All of these arts, the tea ceremony, flower arranging, theatre, ink painting, were expressions of a single underlying truth that Zen Buddhism had planted in the samurai consciousness. That truth was Mushin, often translated as no mind, though this translation barely captures its profound meaning. Mushin was not the absence of thought, but the absence of self-consciousness. It was a state where the mind moved like water, responding perfectly to whatever shape was presented to it, without hesitation, without deliberation, without the interference of the ego. In Chado, Mushin meant that your hands prepared tea without your conscious mind directing them. In combat, Mushin meant that your sword moved before you had time to decide to move it. The self had dissolved. There was only action, only response, only the eternal present moment. To achieve Mushin, the samurai sat in meditation. In the Buddhist temples throughout Japan, in side rooms and meditation halls, thousands of samurai spent hours each day sitting in zazen, a form of meditation where one simply observes the breath and the thoughts that arise, releasing each thought without attachment or judgment. The experience was often described as painful. Your legs would ache, your mind would wander, doubt would arise, but in that discomfort and struggle something was being rewired. The samurai learned to observe his own fear, his own anger, his own desire for survival, and to notice that he was not these things. He was the awareness that observed them. This distinction changed everything. Once you understood that you were not your fear, fear no longer controlled you. The teaching of impermanence, central to all Buddhist philosophy, took on special meaning for men trained to kill and die. The samurai learned that everything he saw, everyone he knew, his own body, his achievements, his very consciousness, all of it was temporary, all of it would fade. The temple gardens were designed to teach this lesson. The sand that had been raked into perfect patterns would be raked again tomorrow, obliterating today's work. The flowers that had been arranged with such care would wilt. The tea served this morning would be gone by evening. and the samurai's own life. It too was temporary. This was not a depressing realization, quite the opposite. Once the samurai truly accepted that his life was temporary, that death could come at any moment, he became free. He no longer clung to life in a way that made him hesitant in combat. He was prepared to die not because he wanted to die, but because he had already died in his mind. He had released his grip on life, and in releasing it, he became fully alive. This is where the sword comes into the story. For all the tea and flowers and paintings were ultimately in service to the sword, and the sword was ultimately in service to a philosophy. The katana, the curved sword of the samurai, was not merely a weapon. It was, in the words of the samurai themselves, the soul of the warrior. To understand the sword was to understand the entire samurai tradition. The katana was so sacred, so central to the identity of the samurai, that there developed around its creation an almost religious mystique. The process of making a sword was not merely craftsmanship, it was spiritual practice. The foundation of the katana lay in a steel called tamahagane, which means jeweled steel. This steel was created in small forges throughout Japan using a unique smelting process that concentrated iron from iron sand. The quality of tamahagane was inconsistent. It contained both very hard iron and softer iron in its crystals, and this inconsistency was the very thing that made it perfect for the Japanese sword. A Western blacksmith might see this variability as a defect. A Japanese swordsmith saw it as raw potential. The skill lay in understanding how to work with these variations to create a blade of extraordinary strength and flexibility. The swordsmith would begin by heating the tamahagane in a forge until it glowed cherry red. The sound of the forge was rhythmic and eternal, the roar of the fire, the hissing of steam when water touched heated metal, the ring of hammer on steel. The swordsmith moved in a kind of trance, striking the same point again and again with precise force, folding the metal back on itself with each strike. He might fold the steel 8 times, or 10 times, or more. Each fold doubled the number of layers. With 10 folds, the steel would have over 1,000 layers, each one microscopically thin, creating a gradient of hardness and softness that gave the blade its unique properties. The repetitive work, the heat from the forge, the sound of the hammer, all of it was meditation. The swordsmith was not consciously thinking about what he was doing. His hands remembered the movements from years of practice. His body knew the temperature of the steel by the colour of its glow. He and the metal had entered into a dialogue, one as ancient as metalwork itself. The physical sensation of this work cannot be adequately described to someone who has not experienced it. The intense heat that made sweat pour from the body, the way the hammer became an extension of the arm after endless repetition, the moment when the swordsmith's awareness shifted and he began to feel rather than think his way through the work. The forge became a sacred space precisely because it demanded absolute presence. The temperature was too hot to tolerate distraction, the hammer too heavy to wield carelessly, the metal too precious to waste on anything but complete commitment. In this way, the forging of a sword became identical to the meditation practices of Zen monks. The body at work, the mind surrendered, the self dissolved in service to something greater. As the blade began to take shape, a thin, beautiful curve emerging from what had been shapeless raw metal, the swordsmith would heat it one final time. At the exact moment of peak temperature, he would plunge it into water and the blade would harden. This tempering created one of the most distinctive features of the Japanese sword, the hamon, or temper line. The hamon was a visible ripple pattern along the edge of the blade created by the differential cooling of hard steel and softer steel. To the untrained eye, it might seem to be merely decorative, but it was a map of the blade's inner structure, a visible sign of the forces that had shaped it. Some swords had hamon that looked like waves, others looked like landscapes, mountains and valleys in miniature. Each pattern was unique, a signature as individual as a human fingerprint. The samurai who received such a sword understood that he was being given not merely a weapon, but a continuation of the swordsmith's own spiritual work. The blade carried within it all those foldings, all those moments of intense focus and meditative work. When the samurai carried his sword, he carried centuries of accumulated knowledge and practice. When he drew it in combat, he was connecting to a lineage of craftsmen and warriors stretching back generations. The sword was never truly his. He was, in a sense, the sword's temporary caretaker. The swordsmiths themselves had achieved an almost priest-like status in Japanese society. The greatest swordsmiths were given names that would be remembered for centuries. The work of their hands was considered sacred enough to be displayed in temples and shrines. The forge where a great sword was made was treated as a sacred space. Before beginning work, the swordsmith would purify himself through ritual. He would take a ceremonial bath. He might fast. He would meditate. When he entered the forge, he was not merely a craftsman beginning his day. He was a priest entering a temple, prepared to undertake sacred work. The way these blades were wielded became an art form unto itself. Different schools of swordsmanship developed throughout Japan, each with its own philosophy and techniques. The Ito-ryu school emphasized the use of a single sword with extraordinary precision and timing. The Niten-ichi-ryu school, the school of two swords, developed the technique of fighting with a longsword and a short sword simultaneously, creating a kind of martial poetry in which the weapons worked in counterpoint, like two dancers moving in perfect synchronization. Different schools emphasized different things. Some focused on the power of strong strikes, others emphasized evasion and precise cutting. Some developed techniques for fighting multiple opponents. All of them, however, shared the core principle derived from Zen Buddhism, that the greatest swordsman was not the one who thought the most, but the one who had transcended the need to think, who had achieved mushin and could respond to an attack with the perfect reaction, faster than conscious deliberation could allow. It was at this moment in history, in the depths of the Muromachi period, that there emerged a figure who would become a legend, a man named Miyamoto Musashi. Musashi was born in 1584 and lived into his 60s, an extraordinary age for someone who spent his life as a professional duelist. He fought over 60 confirmed duels, and it is said he never lost a single one. But what made Musashi truly legendary was not merely his undefeated record, but the philosophy he developed, the way he embodied the synthesis of all that the samurai tradition had become. Musashi fought in an era when Japan was being torn apart. He lived through the final stages of the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, and he understood that the old ways were dying. Yet instead of clinging to tradition, Musashi evolved. He developed his own school of swordsmanship, and more importantly, he wrote a book called The Book of Five Rings, in which he laid out a comprehensive philosophy of the way. In this book, Musashi describes swordsmanship not as a set of techniques to be memorized, but as a living philosophy that encompassed all of life. He discusses the importance of understanding distance and timing, of reading your opponent's intention before they move, of maintaining a calm mind in the face of death. One of Musashi's most famous duels took place on a small island called Ganryu Island. His opponent was a swordsman named Kojiro, who carried a nodachi, a very long sword that gave him an advantage in reach. Musashi arrived late to the duel, kept his opponent waiting in the sun, and then, when they finally engaged, he wielded a simple wooden bokken, a practice sword, against Kojiro's steel blade. The duel lasted only seconds. Musashi's wooden sword struck Kojiro's forehead, and Kojiro fell. The victory was absolute, but what had made Musashi win was not superior strength or technique. It was superior presence. He had disrupted Kojiro's mental state by being late, by the contrast of his simple wooden weapon against the ornate steel, by the absolute calm he brought to the encounter. Musashi had won the duel before the swords even touched. This is the deepest secret of the way. The greatest battles are decided not in the moment of contact, but in the moments before, in the invisible realm where presence meets fear, where certainty meets doubt, where the warrior who is completely at peace encounters the warrior who is carrying anxiety like a weight. A warrior who is calm can perceive these invisible currents. A warrior who is anxious cannot. Musashi understood this so profoundly that he spent as much time studying psychology and the nature of mind as he did practicing with a sword. In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi writes about entering a state he called the eye of yin and yang, a state of perfect perception where you could see not only what your opponent was doing, but what they were about to do, where even their subtle intentions became visible to you. He describes this not as a mystical power, but as the natural result of absolute presence and years of practice. Your consciousness becomes so refined that it can perceive the infinite number of small signs that precede every action, the minute shift of weight, the change in breathing, the contraction of muscles a fraction of a second before they move. A swordsman in this state would not be reacting to attacks that had already begun, but rather responding to attacks that were still in the mind of his opponent. Musashi's philosophy was this: there is no difference between the way of the sword and the way of life. The principles that make a swordsman great are the same principles that make a painter great, a general great, a human being complete. Know yourself, know your opponent, understand the geometry and distance of every encounter, act with absolute clarity and commitment. Practice not merely with your body but with your spirit, until the distinction between practicing and living disappears. The warrior should cultivate an empty mind, should meditate daily, should study philosophy and art, should understand that there is no separation between war and peace, activity and stillness. By the time Musashi reached his 60s, Japan was finally being unified. The fragmentation that had characterized the previous 2 centuries, the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, was coming to an end. This period, lasting from 1467 to 1615, had been one of extraordinary violence and chaos. For nearly 150 years, Japan had fractured into hundreds of competing domains, each one led by a daimyo, a feudal lord, who commanded armies of samurai. These daimyo fought constantly, each trying to expand their territory and power at the expense of their neighbours. The Sengoku period was a time of perpetual warfare, of castles being built and destroyed, of entire provinces changing hands in a single battle. The violence of this age was relentless and comprehensive. Entire families were annihilated. Peasants starved as armies moved across their land, taking their rice, their animals, their sons. Castles bristled with spears and arrows. The rivers ran red. And yet, paradoxically, this age of violence was also an age of extraordinary cultural flourishing. Perhaps because death was so close, so visible, so inevitable, people felt compelled to create beauty with desperate intensity. In the midst of war, samurai built gardens. While fields burned, they practiced tea ceremony. While armies marched, they wrote poetry. The awareness of impermanence that Zen Buddhism taught became not merely a philosophy, but a living reality that no one could ignore. But within this chaos, there emerged 3 figures who would change everything. They would be remembered as the 3 great unifiers of Japan, and their stories read like the unfolding of destiny itself. The first was Oda Nobunaga, born in 1534 into a minor daimyo family. Nobunaga was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly willing to embrace new methods. Where other daimyo clung to traditional samurai tactics, Nobunaga studied the Portuguese, who had recently arrived in Japan, and learned about firearms. He understood something that most of his contemporaries did not, that the age of the pure samurai, the warrior fighting with sword and spear alone, was ending. Nobunaga gathered firearms, trained his soldiers to use them, and began to dominate central Japan through a combination of military innovation and brutal efficiency. He would destroy entire clans that opposed him. He showed no mercy. He had a single goal: the unification of Japan under his rule. By 1582, Oda Nobunaga had conquered most of the central regions of Japan, but his ambitions were not yet satisfied. It was in that year, during a moment of vulnerability when he was staying in a temple in Kyoto, that one of his own generals, a man named Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him. The betrayal was swift and complete. Nobunaga was surrounded in the temple, his guards overwhelmed, and he chose to end his own life rather than be captured. With his death, the unification he had begun passed to another man. This second unifier was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and his story is perhaps the most extraordinary of all. Hideyoshi had not been born into samurai status. He came from the peasantry, rose through the ranks as a soldier under Nobunaga's command, and through intelligence, charisma, and relentless ambition, he eventually became the most powerful man in Japan. After Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi took control of the domains and resources Nobunaga had conquered, and he continued the work of unification. Where Nobunaga had been willing to use the sword, Hideyoshi proved willing to use negotiation, strategic marriages, and calculated force. He offered daimyo the choice: submit to his rule and keep their lands, or resist and be destroyed. Many chose submission. By 1590, Hideyoshi had achieved something extraordinary. He had unified nearly all of Japan under a single rule. The Sengoku period was ending. For the first time in over a century, there was a central authority that could impose peace across the entire archipelago. Hideyoshi, the peasant who had become the most powerful man in Japan, ordered all weapons to be collected, a sword hunt that attempted to remove weapons from the common people. He reorganized society into strict classes, samurai at the top, then merchants, artisans, and peasants at the bottom. A peasant could no longer become a samurai, as Hideyoshi himself had. The fluidity that had characterized the Sengoku period was being replaced with rigid hierarchy. Hideyoshi died in 1598, and his vision of a unified Japan passed to the third great unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was a patient man, a careful strategist, a man who understood that the greatest victories sometimes came not from aggressive action, but from waiting, observing, and striking at exactly the right moment. The samurai called him the patient fox. While other daimyo had fought for dominance, Ieyasu had quietly built up his power base in the eastern regions of Japan. He maintained alliances, chose his battles carefully, and did not reveal all of his strength until he was certain of victory. The moment of final reckoning came in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. This was the greatest battle of the Sengoku period, fought on a misty plain surrounded by mountains, where Ieyasu led an army of 90,000 troops against an opposing coalition that was nearly as large. The battle lasted for hours, the sound of gunfire and the clashing of swords echoing across the plain, warriors falling, blood soaking into the earth. But Ieyasu had chosen his allies more carefully than his opponent had. At a crucial moment during the battle, a group of daimyo who had appeared to be neutral revealed their allegiance to Ieyasu and attacked the flank of the opposing army. The battle turned. The coalition opposing Ieyasu fractured and fell apart. By evening, Sekigahara was his victory. With this single battle, Tokugawa Ieyasu became the undisputed master of Japan. He established the Tokugawa shogunate, which would rule Japan for the next 268 years until the Meiji Restoration. With Ieyasu's victory, the Sengoku period, the Age of Warring States, came to an end. Unification was complete. For the first time in more than a century, there would be peace. But this peace would come with a price. The samurai, who had been shaped by centuries of warfare, would now have to find a new purpose in a time of peace. The sword, which had been the central tool of their existence, would become largely ornamental. The traditions they had developed would ossify into ritual. And yet, before this new age of peace could fully take shape, there was one more shadow to consider. A shadow that had moved through medieval Japan, operating by entirely different rules than the samurai themselves. These were the ninja, the shinobi, the covert warriors who worked in darkness and deception, everything the samurai claimed to be against and yet somehow central to the same history. The ninja emerged from the mountainous provinces of Iga and Koga, regions where traditional samurai power was limited. In these places, where geography was difficult and resources scarce, a different kind of warrior had developed. The shinobi were not bound by the code of honor that governed the samurai. They would use any method to accomplish their goals. Poisons, disguises, explosives, infiltration, psychological manipulation. They would work in the shadows. They would lie. They would use their enemies' expectations against them. Where the samurai fought in open combat, displaying their skill and courage, the ninja operated in secrecy, their identity hidden, their methods concealed. The mountains where the ninja trained were remote and austere. The villages of Iga and Koga clung to steep slopes, surrounded by forests so thick that the sunlight barely penetrated to the ground. In these harsh conditions, a warrior could not rely on the luxuries of samurai culture, the fine swords, the formal training grounds, the established daimyo who would support and honor their service. Instead, the ninja developed a completely different approach to the art of combat. Where the samurai trained for years to perfect a single strike, the ninja trained to strike from unexpected angles, from hiding, with maximum efficiency. Where the samurai cultivated honor and reputation, the ninja cultivated anonymity and deception. The relationship between samurai and ninja was complex. Officially, the samurai looked down on the ninja as dishonorable, as men without virtue, as mercenaries willing to kill for money. The samurai code explicitly rejected deception and covert action. A true warrior should face his enemy openly, should announce his intentions, should fight according to rules that both combatants understood. The ninja represented everything this code opposed, and yet paradoxically many daimyo employed ninja. When the rules of honorable combat did not suit their purposes, when they needed intelligence about enemy movements, when they needed to eliminate a rival without bringing their army into battle, they turned to the ninja. The ninja became the shadow opposite of the samurai. Not the rejection of warrior culture, but its darker mirror, the part of warfare that required methods the samurai code forbade. The training of a ninja was mysterious, passed down through family lines and kept secret from outsiders. From an early age, young shinobi were taught acrobatics, how to move silently, how to climb walls, how to escape from bonds. They learned chemistry and medicine. They learned how to observe people and read their intentions. They learned martial arts, though their fighting style was deliberately practical, focusing on efficiency rather than the elegant techniques the samurai cultivated. A ninja fighting a samurai would not meet the samurai's sword with honor. He would run, would use terrain to his advantage, would poison the samurai's food, would attack from hiding, would do whatever was necessary to complete his mission. The reality of the ninja was probably quite different from the legends that grew up around them. The legends spoke of supernatural abilities, the power to become invisible, to walk on water, to control the weather. The reality was that ninja were skilled operatives who used ordinary methods with extraordinary intelligence. They understood human nature. They understood that people see what they expect to see. A ninja dressed as a monk could walk past guards who were looking for a ninja in black clothing. A ninja who understood the psychology of fear could cause an entire castle to fall into panic with clever use of noise and shadow. The legend of the ninja's supernatural powers was sometimes their greatest weapon, because people who believed a ninja could disappear would see ghosts in every shadow. A ninja might spend weeks observing a castle's guard rotations, learning the name of each sentry, understanding their routine so thoroughly that the ninja could walk past them in disguise, simply by moving at the expected time in the expected way. The ninja understood something fundamental about human perception, that people primarily see patterns, and once a pattern is established, they rarely deviate from it. A ninja moving as part of the expected pattern became invisible not through magic, but through deep knowledge of how the human mind works. In this way, the ninja's seemingly supernatural abilities were actually the fruits of intense observation, psychological insight, and practical intelligence applied with ruthless dedication. By the time Japan was being unified in the late 16th century, the age of the ninja was also coming to an end. A central authority became stronger as the daimyo of Iga and Koga lost their independence. As the Tokugawa shogunate began to impose order, there became less need for the secret arts. Some ninja became mere mercenaries, hiring themselves out to anyone who would pay. Others disappeared into the mountains and into history itself. The shinobi, like the samurai, would have to adapt or fade away as Japan entered a new era. As the sun sets on the age of warring states, we see the samurai tradition at the threshold of transformation. For 7 centuries, the samurai have evolved from crude warriors into something far more complex. Artists, philosophers, mystics, practitioners of the void. They have developed a culture of extraordinary refinement, where the making of a sword is a sacred act, where the preparation of tea is a profound meditation, where the meeting of swords in combat is a form of spiritual dialogue. They have absorbed the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, learning to accept death, to seek the emptiness that lies beneath all phenomena, to understand that the greatest strength comes from the surrender of the self. Here at the Calm Archive, we understand that these stories of the samurai speak to something eternal in the human spirit, the desire to transform ourselves, to find meaning in difficulty, to connect with something larger than our individual desires. The samurai spent 700 years asking the question that still matters to us today. How do we live with meaning when we know that our time is limited? How do we find peace in a world of conflict? How do we honor something greater than ourselves? The unified Japan that Tokugawa Ieyasu was building would be very different from the chaotic Sengoku period that had preceded it. It would be an era of stability, but also of stagnation, where the samurai would have to discover who they were when they no longer had wars to fight. But we will explore that transformation next, in the final sections of our journey. For now, rest in the knowledge that even as one age ends, the wisdom it has accumulated does not disappear. The spirit of the samurai, the spirit that chose death over dishonor, that found the infinite in the finite, that understood that the sword and the brush are ultimately expressions of the same quest for truth, that spirit remains, waiting in the gardens and temples of old Japan, waiting for anyone with ears to hear its whispers, waiting in the silence between moments, which is where all true stories ultimately live. The samurai had conquered Japan. They had done it through will and steel, through centuries of warfare and the relentless application of skill and honor on blood-soaked fields. And then, in the year 1603, something unexpected happened. Everything stopped. The fighting ended. For the first time in over 100 years of constant conflict, Japan fell silent. This silence would last for 250 years. This is the story of what happens to warriors when there is nothing left to fight. The Tokugawa shogunate had finally unified Japan through force and cunning. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the great unifier, understood something profound that most warriors miss entirely. He understood that victory is not merely the moment of triumph on the battlefield. Victory is the ability to maintain power once you have seized it. He created a system so perfectly balanced, so mathematically calculated to preserve his family's authority that it would endure for nearly 3 centuries, and in doing so, he created something that no samurai expected, something that would test their identity in ways that swords and shields could never do. He created peace. Peace is the samurai's greatest enemy. This is a paradox that haunted the samurai consciousness throughout the Edo period, those long centuries of stability and order that followed the chaos of the Sengoku age. Warriors are made for war. A samurai without conflict is like a flame without fuel, slowly diminishing into nothing. Yet here they were, thousands upon thousands of sword-wielding men in a nation where the sword had become irrelevant, where their skills and training had become historical artifacts rather than practical tools. The samurai had to ask themselves a question that had never confronted them before. If I am not fighting, what am I? The answer they discovered was both beautiful and tragic. The samurai became bureaucrats. They became scholars and philosophers and teachers. They became artists and poets and calligraphers. The very men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of killing learned instead the art of living. They built gardens and wrote poetry. They studied philosophy and the movements of stars. They perfected the tea ceremony, where every gesture, every movement, every moment of silence held as much significance as a sword strike once did. This was not weakness. This was not surrender. This was adaptation, and the samurai possessed the discipline to adapt. But somewhere deep in the samurai soul, there was always a question, always a small voice asking, have we lost ourselves? Have we become something other than what we were meant to be? The Tokugawa shogun understood this danger, this slow erosion of purpose that comes with endless peace. And so, through decree and philosophy and careful control, they attempted to crystallize and codify what it meant to be a samurai. They wanted to preserve the samurai spirit not through warfare, but through principle, through a kind of spiritual discipline that could exist independent of actual combat. This led to something remarkable. This led to the creation of Bushido as a unified philosophy, as a way of being that could transcend the circumstances of daily life. Bushido, literally the way of the warrior, was transformed from a practical guide to combat into something far more profound. It became a complete ethical system, a philosophy of how to live, how to think, how to relate to others. It incorporated elements of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shintoism, blending them into something uniquely Japanese. Bushido taught that loyalty was supreme, that honor was more valuable than life, that discipline and self-control were the highest virtues, and the text that would come to define this new Bushido was written not during a time of heroic warfare, but in the quiet years of the early 18th century, by a man named Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Yamamoto Tsunetomo lived through the strange twilight years of the samurai, those middle decades of the Edo period when warriors were caught between their origins and their destiny. He was the retainer of a minor daimyo, a feudal lord, and he spent his life in service to this lord much as generations of samurai before him had done. But he lived in a time of peace, and he witnessed the transformation of his peers from warriors into scholars, from men of action into men of contemplation. When his lord died, Yamamoto did something that even in his own time was considered anachronistic. He followed his lord in death, performing seppuku, the ritual suicide of honor. He believed that his life was bound to his lord's, that to survive his lord's death was a form of betrayal, and yet his superiors forbade him from dying. They stopped him. They forced him to remain alive. This is the deepest tragedy that can befall a samurai. To be forbidden from following your lord into death is a kind of living death itself. In his grief and frustration and desire to maintain some connection to the samurai way that was slipping from his grasp, Yamamoto began to write. He recorded his thoughts in a series of meditations and observations that would be compiled after his death into a single text. That text was called the Hagakure, or Hidden by Leaves, and in its pages Yamamoto attempted to capture something ineffable. He attempted to capture the essence of what a samurai should be when death is not imminent, when honor must be maintained through the daily choices rather than through a final sacrifice. The most famous passage from the Hagakure contains a statement that would echo through the rest of samurai history. "The way of the samurai is found in death," Yamamoto wrote. "When it comes either or, quickly choose death." This is not a call for recklessness. This is not a celebration of death itself. Rather, it is a statement about the proper ordering of values. For Yamamoto, and for the samurai who read his words, death was not the worst thing that could happen. Dishonor was the worst thing. A life lived in shame was worse than no life at all. And therefore, if a choice must be made between death and dishonor, the answer is always clear. Choose death. Choose it quickly. Choose it without hesitation. This philosophy, written during peacetime for an audience that would likely never face the circumstances it described, became the theoretical foundation of the samurai code. It was the final attempt to preserve something sacred in the samurai tradition, something that could not be taken away by peace or changing times. It was an attempt to make the samurai eternal, not through war, but through principle. And then, in the year 1701, something happened that would prove Yamamoto's philosophy was not merely abstract theory. Something happened that would test the samurai code to its absolute limit and create a story so profound, so perfectly emblematic of the samurai spirit, that it would echo through the centuries and become the most famous samurai narrative ever told. This is the story of the 47 Ronin. This is the tale of the Akko incident. This is the story of loyalty and revenge and honor taken to their ultimate conclusion. This is the story that demonstrates that even in the age of peace, the samurai way could still demand everything a man possessed, including his life. The Lord of Akko was a man named Asano Takumi no Kami. He was not a particularly famous or powerful daimyo, but he was liked by his retainers, respected by his people, and was living a quiet life in a period when most samurai were doing the same. But in 1701, there was a ceremony at the Edo castle, at the residence of the Tokugawa shogun. It was a traditional ceremony of the sort that happened regularly, but it was still an important occasion, and Asano, as a daimyo, was required to attend. At the castle, there was a master of ceremonies, a high official named Kira Yoshinaka. Kira was known to be somewhat arrogant and was said to expect gifts and personal tributes from the visiting lords in exchange for his cooperation and respect. Asano either did not know this custom, or he was too proud to participate in it. The accounts differ, but what is certain is that Kira treated Asano with great disrespect during the ceremony. He mocked him and ignored him, and attempted to humiliate him in front of the other assembled nobles. And Asano, perhaps unable to bear this shame, perhaps overcome with rage at the insult, drew his sword within the castle and struck at Kira in a moment of violence. In the shogunate's own residence, in the presence of the assembled nobility, Asano had drawn his sword. This was the most serious crime that a samurai could commit in peacetime. The shogunate's order came swiftly and mercilessly. Asano was ordered to commit seppuku, to end his own life through ritual suicide. He was given the opportunity to die honorably, and he took it. But his crime had consequences that extended far beyond his death. His lands were confiscated, his castle was seized, his samurai retainers were stripped of their service. Suddenly more than 300 men who had served Asano and his family found themselves without a lord, without lands, without place in society. They became ronin, masterless samurai. They were ghosts in a society that had no place for them, men with swords in a nation that had largely abandoned swords. Among these 47 ronin, who would eventually lead the group and seek revenge for their fallen lord, was a man named Oishi Kuranosuke. Oishi was known as a thoughtful and measured samurai, a man of intelligence and strategic thinking rather than reckless passion. And for 2 years after Asano's death, Oishi did something that appeared, to all observers, to be a complete abandonment of the samurai code. He lived a life of apparent dissolution and shame. He was seen in the pleasure districts, in the floating world of entertainers and geishas, drowning himself in drink and excess. He was mocked by the citizens of Edo, who witnessed his descent into what appeared to be degradation. His fellow samurai watched in seeming disgust as he threw away his honor, and became, in appearance at least, worthless. But Oishi was thinking, Oishi was planning. Oishi understood that if he and his companions seemed too loyal, too devoted to the idea of revenge, the shogunate would move against them. The Tokugawa system was built on preventing exactly this sort of thing, preventing men from acting out of loyalty to dead lords rather than obedience to the ruling power. So Oishi, in his apparent degradation, was buying time. He was disarming suspicion. He was creating the space necessary to plan the thing that no one expected, a successful, coordinated act of vengeance against a man protected by the full power of the Tokugawa state. For 2 years, Oishi and the other Ronin waited. They watched. They gathered information. They kept their purpose hidden beneath layers of false indolence and apparent surrender. And then, when the time was right, they struck. On a winter night in December 1703, the 47 Ronin attacked Kira's mansion. They moved with surgical precision, these masterless warriors who had spent 2 years maintaining the appearance of dissolution. They overwhelmed his guards. They moved through his castle searching for him, and they found him hiding in a small room. They brought him before their leader Oishi. Kira attempted to commit seppuku himself, to avoid the ignominy of being killed by commoners, but the Ronin prevented him. Instead, they gave him the death he deserved, and then, in an act that some witnessed as pure revenge and others saw as the highest expression of justice, they killed Kira Yoshinaka, the man who had brought about their lord's death. The revenge was complete. Honor was restored to their lord's name. They took Kira's head and carried it to their lord's tomb, making an offering of his death as a final service. The revenge was complete, but the samurai code was explicit. Revenge was a crime against the state. It was an assertion of personal loyalty over governmental authority. The Tokugawa system could not tolerate it. The samurai hierarchy depended on the authority of the government being absolute, on loyalty to the shogun superseding all personal loyalties. What the 47 Ronin had done, however noble, however aligned with an older code of honor, was a direct challenge to that authority. The 47 Ronin were arrested, they were interrogated, and they were ordered to commit seppuku, to pay for their crime with their own deaths. They accepted this sentence without protest. They had known, perhaps even planned, for this to be the outcome. They had killed their lord's enemy, they had restored honor to his name, and they had accepted the consequence of doing so. One by one, on a cold winter day, the 47 Ronin died by their own hands. They performed seppuku, they followed their lord in death, and they became immortal. They became the supreme example of the samurai code in action. They demonstrated that loyalty and honor could be more important than life itself. They showed that a samurai would accept death without flinching if it meant maintaining honor. They became, in essence, the perfect samurai that Yamamoto Tsunetomo had described in the Hagakure. And their story would be told and retold, dramatized and celebrated for the next 300 years. It would inspire people. It would define the samurai in the popular imagination. It would become the master narrative of what the samurai code truly meant. But while the 47 Ronin were achieving immortality through their loyalty and sacrifice, something else was happening in Japan. Something was slowly poisoning the social structure that had created the samurai in the first place. The rigid hierarchy that the Tokugawa had so carefully constructed, the ordered society where samurai stood at the top and merchants stood at the bottom, was slowly being inverted by the forces of economics. It was a reversal so gradual that most did not notice it happening until it was nearly complete. The samurai were the warrior class, the ruling class, and they received fixed stipends from their lords in payment for their service. These stipends were carefully calculated, limited, and designed to keep the samurai dependent on their lords. These stipends did not increase. Year after year, decade after decade, samurai received the same amount. Meanwhile, the merchant class, nominally at the bottom of the social hierarchy, far below the samurai and even below farmers in the official ranking, was beginning to accumulate vast wealth. Trade was flourishing, cities were growing, money was being made in commerce and trade and the exchange of goods. The wealth of the merchant class grew exponentially. And the samurai, despite their status, their honor, their official position, were slowly becoming impoverished. The contradiction was exquisite and torturous. A merchant could now afford to purchase fine silks and ivory and jade, things that only the wealthy could display, yet they were forbidden by law from dressing in samurai colours. A merchant could now own a grand house in the city, larger than many samurai residences. yet the samurai still held the right to command. A merchant could hire servants and musicians and poets. Yet a single samurai, however poor, could cut down a merchant in the street if they were disrespected, and the penalty would be small. The law preserved the samurai's honor, even as economics destroyed their prosperity. Many samurai found themselves with insufficient income to maintain their status. The cost of their swords, their armor, their formal clothes, the expectations of their position, all exceeded what their stipends could provide. Many were forced to work as teachers or in bureaucratic positions just to survive. Some became craftspeople or artists, selling their skills for money in ways that earlier samurai would have considered humiliating. Many were caught in a position of complete contradiction, socially superior to the merchants who were becoming rich, yet financially dependent on the very system that was enriching them. And worse, they were dependent on the merchants themselves for credit, for loans, for the extension of financial assistance that kept them from absolute destitution. This contradiction would have profound consequences. It created a resentment that would fester beneath the surface of Edo peace, a bitterness among the samurai class that their honor could not purchase rice, that their status could not purchase cloth, that their swords could not purchase the respect they believed they deserved. But for now, in the 18th century, the samurai dealt with their poverty through a different kind of cultural expression. They became patrons and practitioners of the arts of peace. In Edo, in Osaka, in Kyoto, the samurai class, even as it was losing its practical function and beginning to lose its financial base, was becoming an educated, cultured, artistic class. The transformation was real and profound. Calligraphers worked on their brushstrokes with the same dedication that earlier samurai had applied to swordplay. They understood that the brush could be as demanding as the sword, that perfection was just as elusive in the realm of art as it was in combat. Poets gathered in groups to compose haiku, 17-syllable poems of extraordinary subtlety and depth. These were not frivolous entertainments. For the samurai, poetry became a spiritual discipline, a way of capturing something essential about existence in the fewest possible words. One of the greatest poets was a man named Matsuo Basho, who wandered through Japan in the late 17th century, documenting his journeys in poetry of astonishing beauty. Basho lived the life of a wanderer, a Buddhist mendicant almost, despite being born a samurai. He travelled the length and breadth of Japan, sleeping in villages and temples, observing nature and human folly with equal attention. "The old silent pond," Basho wrote. "A frog jumps into the pond, splash, silence again." In these simple lines, in the image of a frog entering water and the return to silence, there is a meditation on the nature of being and non-being, on impermanence and the moment, that captures something essential about the Zen Buddhism that had so deeply influenced samurai philosophy. The tea ceremony became a form of meditation practiced by samurai across the country. In these ceremonies, every movement was prescribed, every gesture carried meaning. The host arranged flowers, whisked tea, moved through space with the precision and intention that a samurai once brought to swordsmanship. A single tea ceremony could last hours. A single moment of pouring water could contain profound meaning. The floating world, the ukiyo, flourished during this period. Kabuki theatre presented elaborate dramas about samurai and romance and human folly, and samurai packed the theatres to watch actors depict their own lives and values on stage. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints depicted beautiful women and actors and landscapes of extraordinary subtlety, and samurai collected these prints, studied them, appreciated their artistry. Geisha culture developed into an elaborate art form, where trained women provided entertainment and conversation and companionship to the wealthy, creating an entire universe of beauty and transience that reflected the Buddhist understanding that all things are temporary. The samurai patronized these women, studied their arts, adopted their aesthetic sensibilities. The samurai, in their long peace, had become connoisseurs of beauty. They had become philosophers and artists. They had transformed their warrior nature into a refined cultural sensibility, and in doing so they had created something remarkable. They had created a bridge between the violent past and the peaceful present. They had proven that the samurai spirit could survive without war, that honor and nobility could be expressed through ink and poetry and gesture as effectively as through steel and blood. This is the world that would be shattered in a single moment in the year 1853. In that year, 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay. They were American warships, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, and they carried with them something that the samurai had never encountered: Western technology on a scale they could not ignore. The arrival of these ships was a shock to the Japanese consciousness. For more than 200 years, Japan had been essentially closed to the outside world, maintaining only limited contact with a few Western traders, and having developed in deliberate isolation. The samurai had assumed that their military dominance was secure, that their way of war was unsurpassed. The samurai had perfected their swords, had mastered the arts of strategy and hand-to-hand combat, had created a warrior culture that they believed to be the apex of human martial achievement. And now, suddenly, they were confronted with evidence that the world had moved on without them. The Western ships were powered by steam. They had cannons of unprecedented power. They had technology that made the samurai sword seem like a relic from an ancient world. They represented an entirely different technological and military paradigm, one that had developed while Japan had been perfecting the arts of peace. While samurai had been composing poetry and practicing calligraphy and perfecting the tea ceremony, the West had been building industrial civilization. While samurai had been studying philosophy and Zen Buddhism, the West had been developing steam engines and rifled muskets and naval supremacy. The shock was absolute. The samurai understood in that moment when they saw those 4 black ships that they were witnessing the future. And the future looked nothing like them. This retention anchor marks a moment of supreme tension. The samurai are about to face extinction, and they do not yet realize it. The samurai are about to be confronted with the greatest challenge in their 700-year history. The samurai are about to discover that honor and loyalty and discipline, the virtues that have sustained them through centuries, may not be enough to survive in a world that is changing at a pace they cannot control or fully comprehend. The appearance of the American ships forced Japan to open its borders. Treaties were signed. Western traders and diplomats began to arrive. Japan was suddenly thrust into contact with industrial civilization, with modern weapons, with ideas and technologies that challenged every assumption the samurai had made about their own superiority. The shock was profound. The samurai who had ruled Japan through military dominance and cultural authority, who had been the undisputed elite of their society, were suddenly confronted with evidence that they were, from a technological and military standpoint, obsolete. This realization did not come all at once. It developed gradually through the 1850s and 1860s, as Western influence increased, and as various factions within Japan struggled with the question of how to respond to this Western intrusion. Some samurai wanted to expel the foreigners entirely, to return to isolation. Others understood that Japan would have to modernize to survive. This internal conflict, this clash between those who wanted to preserve the traditional way and those who believed Japan must change, would lead to a civil war that would destroy the samurai class entirely. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration occurred. The young Meiji emperor, supported by ambitious samurai from the southwestern clans, who understood that modernization was necessary, took power from the Tokugawa shogunate. The system of rule that had lasted for 250 years was suddenly overthrown. The samurai's effective power was already eroding, but what happened next was both more direct and more devastating. The Meiji government, in its determination to transform Japan into a modern industrial nation, began to systematically dismantle the samurai class. They passed laws that prohibited the wearing of the topknot, the distinctive hairstyle that had identified samurai for centuries. They passed laws that prohibited the wearing of swords in public. They began conscripting commoners into a national army, replacing the samurai as the military force of the nation. And then, in 1876, they passed the Haitorei Edict, the Sword Abolition Edict, which made it illegal for anyone except military officers and police to carry swords. The samurai's most sacred symbol, the sword that had defined their identity for more than 700 years, was officially prohibited. In a single stroke of legislation, the samurai class was formally declared obsolete. This was a kind of death without dying. The samurai had spent centuries preparing themselves for honorable death in battle. The Bushido Code had been built on the understanding that a samurai might be called upon at any moment to sacrifice his life for his lord or for honor. But there was no dramatic final battle for most samurai. There was no opportunity for a glorious death in service of a principle. There was no climactic moment where the samurai stood against overwhelming odds and made their final heroic stand. Instead, there was the slow humiliation of obsolescence. There was the pain of having your identity stripped away by law. The government took the top knot, that visible symbol of samurai status that samurai had worn for hundreds of years. The government took the sword, the very instrument that had defined the samurai since the beginning of the warrior class. They took the legal right to wear armor, to lead, to command. They took the social position, the prestige, the automatic respect that had always accompanied the title of samurai. There was the agony of watching a younger generation grow up who would never know what it meant to be a samurai in the traditional sense. For these young people, the samurai were already becoming history, already becoming legend, figures from a past that was rapidly receding. Some samurai accepted this change. They understood that Japan had to modernize to survive, that the nation would be destroyed by Western powers if it did not modernize. They became officers in the new conscript army. They became bureaucrats and businessmen and educators. They put their discipline and intelligence to work in the service of a modernizing nation. They understood that loyalty to Japan as a nation superseded loyalty to the old samurai way. But others could not accept it. Others saw the abolition of the samurai way as a kind of betrayal of everything their ancestors had fought for. Others believed that the samurai code could not be abandoned, that honor required resistance, even futile resistance. They believed that to accept the elimination of Bushido without protest was itself a violation of Bushido. And this resistance led to the last great uprising of the traditional samurai. It was called the Satsuma Rebellion, and it took place in 1877, less than a decade after the Meiji Restoration had begun. The leader of the Satsuma Rebellion was a man named Saigo Takamori. Saigo had been one of the principal architects of the Meiji Restoration. He had been a military genius who had overthrown the Tokugawa system and helped establish the new government. He was respected, feared, and admired by many. But as Saigo watched what he had helped create beginning to tear down the samurai system, he found himself increasingly at odds with the new government's direction. He wanted the samurai to be preserved. He wanted traditional values to be maintained even as Japan modernized. And when his efforts to influence the government from within failed, he returned to his home region in Satsuma and began to organize what he knew would likely be a futile resistance. Saigo was not naive. He understood the mathematics of the situation. The new Meiji government had modern weapons, a conscript army, and artillery. His followers were samurai warriors, trained in traditional sword combat and conventional military tactics. The odds against them were overwhelming. But Saigo understood the samurai code. He understood that sometimes honor requires you to take a stand even when victory is impossible. Sometimes the samurai way demands that you fight not because you might win, but because the alternative is a life without honor. The rebellion began in 1877, when Saigo and approximately 40,000 samurai and supporters moved against the Meiji government. They won some early victories, but gradually they were pushed back by the conscript army, an army whose soldiers were drawn from the common people, from farmers and merchants and anyone the government could recruit. By the time the final battle came, it was clear that Saigo's cause was lost. The final battle occurred at Shiroyama, a small mountain in Satsuma where Saigo and his remaining followers made a last stand. It has been called the last stand of the samurai, and in many ways it was. On one side was Saigo Takamori, leading samurai warriors who were armed primarily with swords and conventional weapons. On the other side was the Meiji government's army, equipped with Gatling guns, artillery, and modern rifles. The battle itself was brief and overwhelming. The samurai charged with swords drawn. The Gatling guns opened fire. The samurai fell. When it was over, Saigo Takamori and most of his followers were dead. The age of the samurai had officially ended. The warrior class that had ruled Japan for nearly 700 years had been defeated not by another samurai, but by conscripted farmers and merchants wielding industrial weapons. The sword had been conquered by the machine. The past had been overwhelmed by the future. Saigo Takamori, mortally wounded on the slopes of Shiroyama, was brought to a cave. He was dying. The battle was lost. The government army had overwhelmed his forces. The samurai charge against modern weapons had failed utterly. All around him, the last samurai were falling, their swords useless against artillery and Gatling guns. And in that cave, facing the end, Saigo Takamori did something that would become the defining image of his life. He requested that one of his retainers perform a final service for him. His retainer, a man who had followed Saigo through years of struggle and had now come to this final moment with his lord, took his sword. And Saigo Takamori, the last samurai, died as a samurai should die. He died by the sword. His retainer ended Saigo's suffering and then performed seppuku himself, dying alongside his lord in the traditional manner. This final act, this last ritual sacrifice in the samurai tradition, occurred on a muddy battlefield while modern weapons roared around them. It was an anachronism, a ghost of an older world, playing out in the shadow of industrial warfare, but it was also, in its way, a kind of perfection. Saigo Takamori died as a samurai. He died for a principle. He died refusing to surrender to a government he believed had abandoned the traditional way. He died following his lord into death, or more accurately, he died as one who embodied the lordly virtues himself. He died performing seppuku in the traditional manner. He could not have asked for a death more aligned with the code that had sustained his people through centuries. His body was never formally recovered, lost in the confusion of the final battle, but his spirit was immediately memorialized. Legend grew up around him. Stories were told, songs were sung, poetry was composed celebrating his sacrifice. Within a few years, remarkably, the Meiji government that had just finished defeating him recognized Saigo as a hero. A statue was erected in his honor, standing in Tokyo. His rebellion was reinterpreted as a noble, if futile, stand for the preservation of the samurai way, and Saigo Takamori became the last samurai, the final embodiment of the warrior code in its pure form. In his death, he achieved a kind of immortality. He became what the 47 Ronin had been to their generation, the perfect embodiment of Bushido, the living proof that honor and loyalty could transcend practical defeat. The samurai are gone now. Their swords are locked in museums, their castles preserved as monuments to a vanished world. The rigid social hierarchy that sustained them for centuries is dust. The shoguns no longer rule. The daimyo no longer command their private armies. The Tokugawa system, which lasted for 250 years and seemed permanent, eternal, unchangeable, was swept away in less than a single generation. What endured for centuries crumbled in decades. The warrior class that had defined Japanese civilization for more than 700 years is a memory, a ghost, a story told to remind people of what was and what could never be again. But their spirit never died. Something of the samurai code persists in modern Japan, transformed and redirected but still recognizable to those who know how to look for it. In martial arts like kendo, where practitioners engage in ritualized combat with bamboo swords, the discipline and respect and hierarchy of the traditional samurai path are preserved. Young students learn to bow, to show respect, to understand that their opponent is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a partner in the dance of combat. In judo and aikido, the principles of leverage and balance and control over raw strength echo the sophistication of traditional samurai martial philosophy. A judoka learns that strength is not merely physical force, but the intelligent application of technique. An aikido practitioner learns that victory does not require defeating an opponent, but rather harmonizing with their energy. In the corporate world of Japan, there is a concept sometimes called corporate bushido, an understanding that employees owe loyalty to their employers, that the company represents a kind of collective entity to which individual ambitions should be subordinated. The concept that you sacrifice your personal desires for the greater good of the group, that you serve something larger than yourself. This is a pale shadow of the true Bushido, but it shows how deeply the values have echoed through time, how the samurai spirit has penetrated into the very structure of modern Japanese society. In martial arts dojos throughout Japan, and now throughout the world, young people bow to their teachers in the same manner that samurai once bowed to their lords. They follow codes of conduct, formal and informal, that govern how they treat one another, how they speak, how they move through the world. They understand that training is not merely about physical technique, but about the development of character and discipline. They understand that there is something transcendent about the pursuit of perfection, even in a physical art. And somewhere deep in that understanding, the spirit of the samurai lives on. The samurai are gone now, but they left behind something that cannot be destroyed by swords or laws or the march of time. They left behind a philosophical legacy, an understanding that honor and loyalty and discipline are values worth organizing your entire life around. They left behind the understanding that there are some things more important than life itself, and that a person who lives according to principle is more genuinely alive than a person who merely exists. They left behind the Hagakure, the code of Bushido, the stories of the 47 Ronin and Saigo Takamori. They left behind the aesthetic sensibility that produced haiku poetry and tea ceremonies and the floating world. They left behind thousands of years of history and literature and philosophy, all of which speaks to a fundamental truth that human beings are capable of extraordinary discipline, extraordinary loyalty, and extraordinary nobility of spirit. This is the samurai legacy. This is what the warriors who chose death over dishonor for 700 years bequeathed to the world. If you have been moved by the journey of the samurai through these sections, if you have felt the weight of their choices and the nobility of their sacrifice, you have been listening to the Calm Archive, where we tell the stories of history in the style of meditative fiction, designed to calm the mind and guide you gently into sleep. The Calm Archive brings you tales from the depths of human civilization, stories that remind us of who we are and what we are capable of becoming. And as you rest now, as you drift deeper into sleep, you might imagine yourself in one of their gardens, in the stillness of the evening, listening to the sound of water and contemplating the beauty of things that pass away, knowing that in that impermanence there is a kind of eternal truth. The samurai understood this. They lived it. And in their death they preserved it for all of us. Sleep now. The stories of the samurai are complete. The warriors have found their eternal rest. And in the darkness of sleep, you join them in that timeless world where honor and nobility and the pursuit of perfection transcend the boundaries of time itself. We have journeyed far through 700 years of samurai history, through the clash of swords and the weight of honor, through the rise and fall of empires and the quiet dignity of warriors choosing their own fate. Now, as the night grows deeper and the world around you settles into stillness, it is time to release the narratives we have held, to set down the heavy armor of wakefulness and rest in the same profound peace that the samurai masters sought through their practice of Zen meditation. For there is something sacred in the transition from consciousness to sleep, and it mirrors precisely the spiritual discipline that shaped these warriors for 7 centuries. The samurai understood a principle that modern science is only now rediscovering, that the mind at rest is not an empty mind, but a mind that has transcended the chatter of thought. This state is called mushin in Japanese, which translates to no mind, or mind without mind. It is not an absence of awareness, but rather an absence of the self that observes and judges, a dissolution of the barrier between the observer and what is observed. When a samurai warrior stood on the battlefield, facing an opponent with sword raised and death dancing between them, the only way to move with perfect grace and timing was to empty the mind entirely, to release every thought about winning or losing, living or dying, to let the body and spirit move as one unified instrument without the interference of conscious thought. This mushin, this no-mind state, is precisely the state your mind naturally seeks as you drift towards sleep. Even now, as you listen to these words, as you feel the comfort of your resting place beneath you, your mind is gradually releasing its grip on the concerns of the waking day. The thoughts that seemed so urgent, so demanding, so essential just hours ago are beginning to dissolve like mist under the morning sun. And this is not a failure of concentration. This is the deepest wisdom of the body, the invitation of your own consciousness to let go, to stop trying, to become the no mind that knows perfect peace. Just as the samurai learned to thrive by emptying themselves of fear and doubt, you are learning now to thrive by releasing the need to think, to analyze, to control. With each breath you take, you practice the discipline the samurai masters spent decades perfecting. Notice the gentle inhalation, drawing the cool air into your lungs like drawing a blade from its sheath, smooth, deliberate, complete. Hold that breath for just a moment, feeling the presence of it, the fullness of the moment. Then exhale slowly, returning the air to the world, returning the blade to its sheath. This simple rhythm, this cycle of taking in and releasing, of activity and rest, mirrors the eternal dance of the warrior's spirit. The samurai were not men of violence isolated from nature. They were men intimately connected to the cycles of the world, to the breathing of the earth itself, to the understanding that all things come and go, rise and fall like the breath itself. Let your attention now settle into this breath, and with each cycle, feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort. Imagine, if you will, that you're no longer in your room but instead walking along a stone path in a traditional Japanese garden at night. The darkness here is not threatening. It is gentle and embracing, woven through with the softest light. Along the path, carefully placed lanterns glow with a warm luminescence. These are called toro, stone lanterns, and they have guided seekers through Japanese gardens for centuries. The light they cast is not harsh or revealing. It is mysterious, illuminating just enough of the path ahead to invite you forward, while leaving vast territories of shadow and suggestion around you. The lanterns themselves are simple, elegant structures. A square or cylindrical base, a middle section with an opening from which the light emanates, a roof that gently slopes to shelter the flame. Stone worn smooth by generations of rain and wind, darkened by centuries of weather and time. As you pass each lantern, you pause to observe how the light filters through the carved openings, casting intricate patterns of shadow and illumination on the ground before you. Some lanterns are positioned beside a still pond, their light reflected perfectly in the water below, creating the illusion that there are lanterns both above and below, that light exists in parallel worlds connected by this glassy surface. To your left, this pond stretches into shadow. The surface is so still that it seems almost like dark silk laid out beneath the night sky. But when you look closely, you see movement, the gentle ripples created by a koi, those ancient and patient fish with scales of gold and crimson and pearl white. The koi move through the darkness with an unhurried grace, rising occasionally to the surface where they create small circles of disturbance, as if asking permission to exist in this quiet space. The koi are themselves symbols deeply meaningful to the samurai. They represent perseverance, courage, and the ability to thrive in any circumstance. These fish live for decades, sometimes longer than the humans who tend them, slowly moving through their watery world in meditation, asking nothing, simply being. With each step along the stone path, you notice the moss beneath the lantern light. Moss grows here abundantly, a soft emerald green that suggests moisture, shade, and the passage of much time. Moss only thrives where conditions are just right, where water is present but not overwhelming, where sunlight filters through but does not burn, where human disturbance is minimal. The Japanese gardeners understood that moss was not a mere decoration or an accident of nature. It was a teacher, showing where the garden had found its own harmony, its own balance. You can imagine, if you touch it lightly, how soft it would be, how cool, how alive with the quiet resilience of things that persist through seasons and centuries. The samurai too understood this quiet persistence, that true strength is often still, often green, often growing in the shadows where the harsh sun does not shine. Ahead on the path, you encounter one of the garden's most distinctive features, a shishi or doshi, a water device that translates as deer scarer. It is a simple bamboo pipe, one end positioned above a small stream. Water, drawn from some higher source, from some hidden spring or careful system of gentle channels, flows continuously into the upper end of the bamboo. When enough water accumulates, the bamboo tips forward, the water empties with a soft rushing sound, and the bamboo swings back, striking a stone with a hollow click. This cycle continues endlessly, water flowing, gathering, tipping, clicking, returning to stillness, waiting for the next cycle to begin. You sit beside this device and listen to its rhythm. Click. The strike of bamboo on stone echoes softly through the garden. Then silence, full of anticipation. You hear the gentle trickle of water beginning to gather again in the waiting bamboo. The silence stretches and deepens. Your breath synchronizes with this rhythm. You inhale during the quiet pause. You exhale as you hear the next click. Click. The sound is sharp but not alarming. It is almost friendly, almost a reminder that time is passing, that the world continues its ancient rhythms, that change and cycles are not to be feared but welcomed as part of the fundamental nature of existence. This device has no purpose beyond what it does. It does not think about its function. It does not worry about being a deer scarer. It simply performs its role with perfect fidelity, click after click, night after night, season after season. As your eyes grow heavier and you're breathing deeper, you continue to wander the garden path. The stepping stones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries of passage. Each stone is slightly different from the last. Some are darker granite, some are lighter stone weathered to shades of silver and grey. Moss grows between them in soft tufts, suggesting that even the path itself is slowly being returned to the living world. The samurai who built gardens like this understood something profound about beauty. that perfection is not about newness or polish, but about the evidence of time and care and use. A perfectly pristine garden would feel sterile, uninviting, dead. But a garden that shows the weathering of seasons, the softening of stone, the slow claim of moss and lichen, such a garden invites you in, assures you that all things age gracefully, that there is no shame in bearing the marks of time. Now in the deepest part of the garden, you find yourself in a small clearing beneath a cherry tree. Even in the darkness you can sense the presence of this tree, old, gnarled, its branches spreading wide like open arms, and scattered across the ground in the soft light of the lanterns you see the fallen cherry blossoms. This is sakura, that most beloved of all flowers in Japanese culture, the cherry blossom that blooms for only the briefest moment in spring before falling to the ground. The samurai knew intimately the power of sakura. They understood that the beauty of the blossom derives partly from its transience, from the fact that it lasts only days, that soon winter or summer will come, and the tree will stand bare or thick with leaves, and the blossom will be only memory. The Japanese call this awareness mono no aware, which translates roughly as the pathos of things, or the gentle sadness of transience. It is not a despairing sadness, but rather a bittersweet recognition that all beautiful things are temporary, that everything we love will end, that all life moves toward death. But here is the strange paradox that the samurai understood so well, and that you can understand now in this moment of rest. This awareness of impermanence does not diminish the beauty of the blossom, it enhances it. The blossom is beautiful precisely because it will fall. The blossom is precious precisely because it lasts only days. If the cherry blossom bloomed forever, unchanging, eternal, it would be no more beautiful or meaningful than plastic flowers in a corporate lobby. But because it is brief, because it is fragile, because we know that even as we admire it, it is already falling, it becomes achingly beautiful. Your own life, the samurai would remind you, is like the cherry blossom. Your days are finite. Your beauty is real precisely because it is temporary. The people you love will be temporary, not because you will lose them, but because life itself is temporary. And this is not a reason for despair. This is a reason for full presence, for gratitude, for the deepest appreciation of each moment. The samurai lived with such intensity, with such aliveness, not despite their awareness of death, but because of it. They knew that every moment might be their last, and so they made each moment matter. They made each gesture beautiful. They transformed the mundane act of living into a kind of meditation, a kind of art form. And now, as you rest, you are practicing this same art, the art of being fully present to the simplicity of your own rest, the art of appreciating the temporary shelter of your bed, the temporary rest of sleep. The fallen cherry blossoms lie scattered at your feet. Some have landed on the moss and sunk slightly into its soft texture. Some have landed on the stone path and remained pristine, their pale pink petals exactly as they fell from the branch. Some have drifted to the edge of the pond and begun their journey across the water. In the darkness you cannot see all the petals clearly. Some are visible in the lantern light, others have already dissolved into shadow. This too is instructive. You do not need to see everything clearly to appreciate its presence. You do not need to understand everything to be at peace with it. Some of the beauty of the garden comes from what you cannot see, from what remains hidden in shadow, from what suggests itself without fully revealing itself. Breathe now, deeply. With each inhalation, feel yourself drawing in the peace of this garden, the scent of moss and stone and bamboo, the feeling of being held in a space that has been cared for by generations of gardeners who believed that tending to beauty was a sacred practice. With each exhalation, release whatever thoughts remain, release the day, release your concerns, release your grip on wakefulness. Your breath moves through you like water through the shishio-doshi, like light through the lanterns, like the seasons moving through the cherry tree. You are not separate from these cycles, you are part of them. Your rest is part of the earth's rest. Your sleep is part of the world's sleep. From somewhere in the distance you hear the sound of a temple bell. It is not the sharp sound of a bell struck and immediately released. It is the sound of a large bronze bell being struck once, slowly, intentionally, allowed to resonate fully before the sound gradually diminishes. The tone is deep, rich, impossibly complex. If you listen closely, you can hear multiple frequencies within the single note, high frequencies and low frequencies, the vibrations creating harmonic overtones that seem to contain entire universes of sound. The samurai heard these bells and understood that a single moment, fully experienced, contains infinite depth. A single sound, if you truly listen, reveals itself to be vast and multifaceted and far more complex than you initially believed. This is the meditation that the samurai masters taught. Not to achieve something, not to gain something, not to become something different from what you already are, but rather to listen, to notice, to allow your awareness to expand into the fullness of each moment until the boundary between yourself and the moment dissolves. The bell continues to resonate even as it fades. The sound waves travel out through the night air, pass through the garden, pass through the walls of your room, pass through your body itself. You are made of the same substance as the bell, the same substance as the air that carries the vibration. The sound is not outside you, affecting you from a distance. The sound is already inside you, already part of you. There is no real separation between the bell and your ear, between the sound and your hearing, between the world and your perception of the world. As the sound of the bell gradually fades into silence, notice how the silence that follows is not empty. The silence is full of presence. The silence contains the memory of the sound, the anticipation that the sound might come again, the wholeness that emerges when the ringing finally stops. This is Mushin, the no-mind state that the samurai sought. The mind releases its constant commentary, its endless analysis, its need to interpret and categorize and judge. In its place comes a profound presence, a clarity that requires no thought, a peace that does not depend on external circumstances. Here at the Calm Archive, we understand that stories about warriors and honor and ancient disciplines are not just entertainments for the intellect, they are instructions for the soul. Every story we tell about the samurai is ultimately a story about you, about the warrior within your own being who must face the challenges of existence with courage and grace. The samurai did not separate their spirituality from their martial practice, and you need not separate your peace from your active life. The same principles that guided a samurai warrior through battle, presence, acceptance, the willingness to release control and trust in a larger flow, these are the principles that now guide you into sleep, that carry you safely toward rest. The night in the garden grows deeper. The light from the lantern seems to glow more softly, or perhaps your eyes are simply closing. Time moves differently in the garden. It is no longer organized by clock and schedule, but by the natural rhythms of darkness and light, of sound and silence, of breathing in and breathing out. You may notice that you have stopped walking. You are now sitting beneath the cherry tree, your back against its ancient bark, the fallen petals scattered around you. The moss is soft beneath you. The lanterns glow in the distance. The sound of the shishiodoshi continues its patient click and wait rhythm, reminding you that it is perfectly natural for things to pause, to gather, to prepare for the next movement. The concept of wabi-sabi encompasses much of what you have experienced in this garden. It is an aesthetic principle, but more than that, it is a way of seeing and being in the world. Wabi refers to a sense of loneliness, of subtlety, of the incomplete. Sabi refers to the patina of age, the beauty that emerges through time and weathering. Together, wabi-sabi means finding profound beauty in things that are imperfect, impermanent, incomplete, worn, and humble. A chipped teacup is more beautiful than a perfect one because it shows the hands that have held it, the journey it has taken. A garden overgrown with moss is more beautiful than a manicured lawn because it shows the interplay of human intention and natural process. Your own aging face, if you could see it in the lantern light, would show the marks of your own journey, the lines created by every laugh and every tear, and these marks are a kind of beauty that perfection could never possess. The samurai lived by wabi-sabi without necessarily naming it. They built gardens that celebrated imperfection and impermanence. They created pottery that glorified asymmetry and accident. They arranged flowers in a way that emphasized emptiness and suggestion, rather than abundance and statement, and they lived their lives the same way, not trying to control every aspect, not trying to remain forever young and perfect, but rather accepting the changes that time brought, celebrating the wisdom that age could confer, finding beauty in the very fragility and uncertainty that made life meaningful. Your eyes are now almost completely closed. The garden is fading into something like a dream, the boundaries between what you see and what you imagine beginning to blur and dissolve. The lanterns continue to glow, or perhaps you're simply remembering how they glowed. The blossom petals continue to fall, or perhaps you're simply aware of their falling without needing to see it. The shishi-odoshi continues its click and pause, its patient rhythm now matching your heartbeat, now matching the rhythm of your breathing. You're no longer observing the garden as someone separate from it. You have become the garden, or the garden has become you, and the distinction no longer seems important. The deepest lesson of the samurai, the lesson that took them 700 years to perfect, the lesson that entire lives were devoted to embodying, is simply this. To live fully, one must accept that all things end. This is not a pessimistic philosophy, though it might seem so on the surface. It is, in fact, the most optimistic philosophy imaginable, because it frees you from the exhausting attempt to hold on to things that cannot be held on to. The samurai knew that their lives would end. They knew that their reputation would eventually fade. They knew that the great works they accomplished would eventually be forgotten, or overturned or replaced. And knowing all of this, they chose to act with honor and integrity anyway. Not for a reward that would persist forever, but for the simple rightness of the action itself. Not for the sake of legacy or fame, but for the sake of living with courage in each moment. This acceptance does not bring despair. It brings profound peace. When you accept that all things end, you no longer waste energy trying to prevent the ending. When you accept that you will die, you no longer live in denial of your own mortality. When you accept that this moment will pass, you no longer resist the natural flow of time. And in place of this resistance comes a kind of gratitude, a kind of aliveness, a willingness to be fully present to what is actually happening, rather than what you wish were happening or fear might happen. The samurai called this living in the present moment. Modern mindfulness teachers call it presence, but the result is always the same, a kind of liberation, a kind of peace, a kind of homecoming to the truth of what is. You are becoming aware now of the smallest details in the garden, a single cricket chirping from somewhere in the darkness, the sound of wind moving through bamboo stalks, a rustling that is almost like whispering, the gentle lap of water from the pond as a koi rises to the surface and sinks back down. These sounds form a symphony of night sounds, but there is no need to analyze them or separate them from each other. They are simply the song of the night, the music of the world at rest. You do not judge this music or try to improve it. You simply listen, and in listening you become part of it. Another sound reaches you from far away. Another temple bell, a different temple in a different part of the mountains, its tone slightly different from the first. The two tones seem to mingle in the night air, creating harmonies and interferences and subtle combinations. You have not moved from beneath the cherry tree, yet somehow you have travelled far, and you are ready to travel farther still, down toward the deepest realms of rest and sleep. Imagine now that you are laying in the garden, no longer sitting but lying flat, the moss beneath you softer than any mattress, the starlight above you filtered through the branches of the cherry tree. Your bed has become this garden, or this garden has become your bed. Again, the distinction is no longer important. You are safe here. You are held here. There is nothing left to do and nothing left to achieve. The battle is over. You have lived with honor, with presence, with courage. Now there is only rest. Your breathing has slowed. Each breath comes naturally, without effort, like water flowing downhill, like the seasons changing, like the inevitable movement of time itself. You do not need to control your breathing anymore. You do not need to control anything. The samurai learned to release control in order to be most effective, to surrender the illusion of control in order to act with perfect grace. And now, at the threshold of sleep, you do the same. You release control. You surrender to the natural wisdom of your own body, which knows how to rest, which knows how to restore itself, which knows exactly what you need. The cherry blossoms have stopped falling, or perhaps they are still falling and you are simply too close to sleep to notice. The lanterns have grown dim, or perhaps your awareness has simply begun to turn inward, away from external light toward the inner darkness. The crickets continue their song, but their sound seems to come from very far away, like a memory rather than a present sound. You're sinking deeper now, beyond the garden, beyond thought, beyond the need to understand anything at all. You're in the space between waking and sleep, that sacred threshold that the samurai knew as a kind of death. The death of the waking self, the dying away of the day's concerns, the release of all that no longer serves you. And in this space, you are safe. You are warm. You are held by the love of everyone who has ever cared about you, held by the love of the earth itself, held by the fundamental rightness of your own existence. You have lived this day, you have done what you could. Now there is nothing left but rest. The samurai taught that in accepting the inevitability of death, life becomes fully alive, and so too in accepting the necessity of sleep, you become fully alive within your rest. This is not a defeat. This is not a failure. This is the completion of the cycle, the natural return to the source, the homecoming of your consciousness to the great rest from which all consciousness emerges. The night deepens, the garden fades. All that remains is the gentle rhythm of your breath, the feeling of safety and peace, the knowledge that you are exactly where you are meant to be, doing exactly what you are meant to do. There is no more journey to take tonight. There is no more awakeness to maintain. There is only this moment of rest, this sanctuary of sleep, this peace that the samurai knew was the ultimate reward for a life lived with honor. Sweet dreams, dear friends. Rest well, with honor. Sleep now, knowing that you have journeyed far, that you have learned much, that you have earned this rest. The Calm Archive holds you in its gentle embrace. May you wake refreshed. May you walk through your own days with the grace of a samurai. And may you always remember that every moment, no matter how ordinary, contains within it the beauty of the cherry blossom and the peace of the garden at night. Good night. Sleep well. The world will still be here when you wake, and so will you.